I had the opportunity to host Christine and Bishop John Shelby Spong for a dinner in my home a few years ago, and the conversation got around, as it usually does among men of a certain age, to talk about our children. And we both remarked that, without judgment, that our children, having grown up in the home of a pastor, had left home never to attend church again. John shared with me that his daughter had explained to him, the church has all of the answers to questions that no one is asking. And generally speaking, I couldn't agree more. It was about that time that I was becoming aware of the fact that the people of the 21st century, especially progressive people, my tribe, were just not really interested in hearing any more about the Bible. John continued to write right up until his stroke, one book after another about the Bible, as have some of my other friends in academia. But once we had convinced our liberal constituents that God didn't write the Bible or any other sacred writings, and that Scripture is the product of sometimes very sincere but often horribly misguided ancient authors, then the obvious question becomes, why should anyone make knowing more about it a priority in their lives? A generation ago, most people in the United States would have at least believed that the content of the Bible was important, whether they ever actually opened that giant King James Bible standing on the hand-carved olive wood stand on their coffee table or not. They thought it was important. But now the tables have turned, and only a fraction of society, usually that fraction that still goes to fundamentalist or evangelical churches, still pretend that Scripture is important. But let's be honest, it does not appear to have much of an impact on them. Once we have been set free from the mental prison of traditional religions, once we realize that heaven and hell are creations of the church that have been knowingly or unknowingly used by clergy in order to manipulate their congregations, fear of eternal punishment in hell and the desire for eternal retirement in heaven, those threats and promises that have served as an invisible carrot and stick to keep people coming to church, keep them making offerings and tolerating tedious sermons and sometimes absolutely miserable music. So once you accept that they're not real, that God is not a finger-wagging patriarchal parent in the clouds, and that not only is the Bible not a reliable repository of eternal truths, but nothing else is either. And it's up to us to figure out what is true and what is right and what is good. Then if you're still inclined to go to a building and gather together with a bunch of like-minded people, what are you going to do? Once you unlock the door and turn on the lights and everybody finds a seat, what happens then? I believe that the number one thing that poisons modern communities of faith is nostalgia. Let me give you an illustration of what I mean. In 1997, the Congregational of National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C., extended an invitation, what we call a call, to me to come to Washington and be their senior minister. It was an amazing opportunity for a 40-year-old preacher. But I didn't end up accepting the invitation for a laundry list of perfectly good personal and professional reasons. But one of the issues that made me realize that I would fail if I had gone was the list of expectations that the search committee had expressed in our months of interviews and conversations. That church's sanctuary in the middle, there's 3 buildings, but in the middle, the sanctuary is a cathedral. It's immense, it has imposing stone architecture, and then the cathedral is flanked on either side, an office building on one side and an education wing on the other. In the 1950s and 60s, when Washington was largely populated by the people who worked in government or served in the military or in local businesses, that church had a thriving Sunday school program, replete with all of the youth groups and children's choirs and family-centered activities that frankly were a part of almost every church anywhere in America at the time. But as Washington became either too expensive or too dangerous for people to live in to raise their families, and as life became modernized by new technologies of entertainment and communication and transportation, they found themselves becoming a very small congregation. Only a remnant of a Sunday school program was left, and not even so much as a hint of an active youth program or children's choir. But their members remembered, before they had moved to Virginia and Maryland and commuted 2 hours to get there and home, they remembered how active the church had been back in the 60s. And without saying it specifically this way, the leaders of the congregation had communicated to me that they wanted those halcyon days to return. Now, I wanted the pulpit. I wanted to preach in Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from the White House, and where I had at least a chance of having some impact on the members of Congress on Capitol Hill. But I knew there was absolutely no way that I could work the magic necessary to recreate the 1960s in the 1990s. The world has changed, and it will not go back to what it was. National City Christian Church was, at least in 1997, I hope they've moved on, but in 1997, they were an extreme example of how nostalgia was strangling the life out of most denominational churches. It is true in a corporate way that the institution has a memory of a more vibrant and exciting church that they used to be, and they want to get back to that. But there are also individual memories that make people cling to ancient liturgies and familiar hymns that defined their childhood, but which, if any of them were honest, they would admit they're never going to drive down the road and pop in a CD of church hymns. They don't really like that music, but that music made them feel a particular way. It reminded them of something that they had a really good feeling about, even though it no longer carries the theological meaning that it might have carried in decades past. I mean, really, washed in the blood? Who wants that? For nearly a century, educated clergy have been trying to make the church relevant again by just gradually making their services a little more progressive. It's interesting in ministers' meetings, you'll hear ministers talk about what you can get away with in particular congregations. How far can you go in modernizing the church? So they toned down the fear of hell. They made nearly universal promises of eternal reward that no one actually knows anything about, but they made it all seem very reassuring and very pleasant. And they even tried to update the language of Scripture and hymns to make them less gender and racially biased. And to a certain degree, such changes are laudable. They've been helpful in some ways. But in the end, they look a lot like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It was too little, and it was too late. Now, people can change. People do change. But the sorry truth is that people don't change very much. And when they do, they don't do it very quickly. When we started this progressive congregation here in Springfield in 2008, I think that we had a pretty firm grip on what the modern church needed to be. We had a good grip on a reliable academic view of theology. But once we went into the room where we were going to have services, initially our muscle memory took over and our services looked a lot like what we used to do in the churches that we were mad at and never going back to. Our habits tended to override our intellect. We had preludes and postludes. We had candles and doxologies. We had prayers of intercession and communion, and even an occasional baptism. We did sing progressive hymns that had been written by very intelligent liberals that were largely set to music that could only be described as being both unsingable and unbearable. Initially, at least, we gave some homage to the common lectionary. We always read scripture in the service, even though we were increasingly ignoring its relevance and its authority in our lives. I eventually all but ceased to wear vestments. If you see me in vestments, I'm either about to be arrested or somebody has just died. And I often found myself being much more ready to discard elements of the liturgy that were mere shadows of the supernatural theism of the churches that we had left behind. But I often found church members that were less eager to abandon even these bare minimum nostalgic ties to what had made church meaningful in the past. It's difficult to pinpoint, but you will hear people saying of a particular church experience that it either did or it did not feel like church. When we first started, we had Christmas Eve services 2 or 3 years before we realized that we weren't really interested in things like that. And for a couple of years, I went to a nearby university where a friend of mine was the director of the music program to listen to their students sing a lessons and carol program in a very crowded church. And I can remember as plain as day sitting there perspiring in the overcrowded church that not one word of that meant a thing to me anymore, that I was so far past incarnational theology that the nostalgia couldn't wring any more drops of emotional reaction out of me. It's sort of like most of us have not been to a movie theater since COVID-19 pandemic began, but when we get to go back, whether you take your mask off or not to actually eat popcorn in the theater, you are going to expect to smell popcorn because that is associated with what it means to go to a movie theater. Now, they might, for health reasons, and they probably should, just stop selling concessions. They should tell everybody, even when the pandemic is over, that you should wear a mask when you're sitting in a theater for 2 hours and not take it off. But we'll still go, but in the absence of the smell of popcorn, it won't feel the same. And church has a lot of the smells and bells of our childhood that we need some of that to feel like church. Maybe our first decade of transformation was necessary for us to begin to give more weight to function in what we do when we get together and less importance to form. But now at this writing, when churches that care about the lives of their members are not meeting in person, and if your church is still crowding people into a sanctuary for an hour or 90 minutes on Sundays, then shame on you. You shouldn't be doing that. But while we are a church in exile, appearing only on the internet to those who seek us out, we have to ask, what will we do when this current pandemic is over and we can invite people to come back for an actual seated service? Surely the advent of vaccines will eventually bring this pandemic to an end, but none of us should be so naive as to think there won't be another one. The earth is now overcrowded and the environment is overstressed, and there will be other pandemics. Our church went from having a fairly formal, though very progressive and reformed service in our Sunday gatherings, and when we had to go into exile, for a few months, we did a stripped-down service that we were putting on the internet that included a meditation, 3 songs performed by professional musicians, no congregational singing, and a wisdom lesson, a sermon, and a benediction. After a few months of doing that, we realized that even having a couple of people singing in a room with a dozen people in it was just increasing our chances of infecting one another. And so we've now reduced our online offering to just me. But what will we do when we can invite our congregation to reassemble in person? As a matter of health safety, I assume that there will never again be another passing of the peace where you ask church members to mingle and hug and shake hands and interact. It's just not smart. Viruses don't have wings, they don't have legs, they depend on a set of lungs to transfer them, and if we start milling around and touching each other again, we're going to pass first one virus and then another. I further assume that there will be no more virus-spreading congregational singing or unison readings. And I strongly suspect after a couple of years, no one will miss them. And I hope that we will take this forced break as a time to take final steps in ridding ourselves of the vestiges of the more magical elements of traditional faith. Even when you reinterpret something like a communion service so that it's no longer a sacrament theologically, it still somehow reinforces some of the supernatural theism and magical thinking of our sacramental past. Why then do post-theistic people gather at all? Isn't it to build community? Isn't that really why we would not just divert all of our religious attention to what we get online? Don't we give one another mutual encouragement, sometimes actual physical support in times of need or crisis, as well as organizing ourselves to be a positive force in a changing world so that we can organize demonstrations or protests or collectively work together in anti-poverty programs? When we gather, don't we try to educate, inform, and inspire one another during those times that we're together for 45 minutes or an hour or 90 minutes? So while I'm not personally throwing down the gauntlet to get rid of all modern church rituals, or maybe I am personally throwing down the gauntlet, but I recognize that everyone doesn't agree with me, and most of those rituals don't hurt me, but I do think they tend to perpetuate magical thinking, and I would argue that we should try to wean ourselves off of them. But I do want to emphasize what is useful, that if the church is gathering in order to educate, inspire, heal, and to help us organize, then music can play a big role in that if it is music that lifts our spirits and inspires us. And that's why we've tended towards secular music that comes out of labor union organizing and civil rights movements. And there ought to be more of that kind of music being written and used. We should have sermons that teach, that expose us to new ideas and help us to think about things in different ways. And if we have meditations or wisdom lessons, those too should educate. Now, I was in seminary 40 years ago, and I remember my professor saying that the liturgy should teach. And I think it did. It's just that it taught a lot of wrong things. I think we need to be very careful now about writing our gathering services so that they are educational, inspirational, and sometimes provocational. I hope that progressive churches will economically survive the current pandemic. That isn't certain. I've heard that 1 out of every 6 restaurants that was open in February will not be open in January. And I suspect that the toll on churches will probably be larger than the toll on restaurants. Most of what passes for spiritual education and inspiration is likely to migrate to online formats. And that's been true for us for a long time. We've had thousands of viewers online for several years with only 50 or 60 people sitting in the room together. But for those of us who find value in community, I hope that by the summer of 2021 that we'll have some place to go. And even more, I hope that the church that we go to will no longer be tethered to sheer nostalgia, to continue offering profound answers to questions that no one is answering or no one is asking. I hope that our churches, our progressive churches, will emerge as healing and empowering communities of faith that can bind up the wounds of the people who have been broken by life, and that what we say and what we do will give people in power some good reason to be nervous. I hope that our churches will be centers of education and activism, organizing intelligent people of goodwill to become advocates for the environment, for the poor, to fight racism and classism, to oppose international wars, and to welcome immigrants, providing a safe space for people of different sexual orientations or races or languages. This time of the pandemic church closure will end up killing off a lot of churches. And there is a part of me that can't even pretend to be sad about that. As important as the church has been to me in the past, if churches are going to just reopen to try to reignite our addiction to church nostalgia, then I would wish that they would just stay closed. But if we can use this time to reinvent the church so that we can emerge from our time in exile as a more meaningful, a more useful, a more prophetic church, then I hope we come back out of sabbatical roaring like a lion. The world doesn't need our dusty old texts. The world doesn't need our tedious hymns. But the world is in desperate need of reliable leadership. I never get tired of that line from Bruce Coburn's song, Lovers in a Dangerous Time, where he reminds us that it is our job to keep kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. We have a lot of darkness in the world that needs some kicking. And if I may appropriate the saying, I came here to do two things: chew bubble gum and kick darkness. And I'm all out of bubble gum. So let's get at it.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.